my name is Alex B. Gates. I have an email address, and I'm on Twitter. Really quick, if you want to know about me, I'm a freelance web developer. My path I like to talk about is CompuServe, and AOL, and then as we started getting like browser, like GUI things, and we're in browsers, there was chat rooms, and you could do some crazy things inside chat rooms where you would put HTML in there and change backgrounds and change font colors and make things happen for everybody in there. That's really where I first started learning HTML and the things that you could do inside chat rooms, which led me to this fantastic place called GeoCities, where I had a nice little home in South Beach in GeoCities, and that's really the first web work that I was doing. And from there, I went to college, and I didn't really know what I was doing in college. I didn't really think about computers too much. But I had a lot of experience, building websites, HTML, really no CSS at that point, right? But after college, I know that I needed to get a real job. I was getting married, I was having a baby, time to get real. So I got a job at a publishing company in Eastern Iowa, and they do like cookbooks, cookbook publishing for fundraisers, so church groups and other things. So they had this really complex, basically FileMaker. It was a FileMaker database. So FileMaker is like a visual database, relational database program, very similar to Access. It's actually owned by Apple. So anyway, they were doing everything in FileMaker. They had all these internal workflows with the Apple script things to build cookbooks and all these things. So they basically replaced the day of where people would send in recipes and they would have all these people typing them out. So they were doing everything in there. They wanted somebody to make it so they could start building their books online and allow people to submit their recipes online. And so I was young and needed a job, and so they gave me a very low wage to kind of join in. And honestly, the first day that I was there, I was watching right? And what is relational databases? So I mean, it was a really good thing to to get me exposed to it. I quickly learned that working with FileMaker was a pain, and the workaround that we had to do in order to get stuff from the web down was a pain, but I think it kind of set me up to appreciate better systems later on. And at the same time, I was picking up WordPress stuff, and because of WordPress and all of its procedural PHP glory, I figured that's how you do things. And so I wrote a lot of very large apps in PHP, procedural PHP, that occasionally I would have other people come in and help and check things out and look at it and say to me, I don't care what you pick, but pick a framework. I mean, it was spaghetti code, a lot of stuff I'm not really proud of, but we've even in my professional career launched a lot of high traffic sites that we made a lot of money with procedural PHP. But from there, I decided that I was going to start getting into some sort of framework, and Laravel just felt like a natural fit. I messed around with Cake PHP for about days, and then I came across Laracast and kind of went through that. And so for me, I do a lot of free work for folks, and in one case, I was building an app for my kids' school to place my kids go to a school where they do enrichment activities in the afternoons. So it used to be where they would have an 8x10 piece of paper, and they would rank classes 1 through 6 for each day, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and then the vice principal would stay up late, for 2 nights in a row, trying to fairly place people. And I have a tendency to sometimes say, well, that sounds like a good job for computers, right? Because it really does. But I didn't, after I got into it, I didn't want to build some PHP crap. So I was like, okay, this is a good example where it's pretty clean cut. I'll use Laravel. I'll go through Laracast. And from there, it's I'm using, in addition to a lot of WordPress supporting clients. But I love it. The other point down here is I'm not an expert. And so if I say something that's wrong, or if there's other opinions on that, don't feel like you can't interrupt or wave your hand or whatever. So chime in with any good puns or one-liners as well too. I dig that. So we're talking about Laravel form validation, and I have a why do we need this slide. But first, really quickly, we should probably talk about what it is. And that's just making sure that data submitted through a form or data that hits an API is being checked for what it's supposed to be. And that we're not doing anything. We're not letting the system take something that it's not supposed to have and potentially create some issues. So why do we need this? User experience is a good thing. What we want when folks are filling out forms, we want to make sure that when they give us the information, we store that information, that it's saved the right way so that when we display it back to them, it actually works. There's data integrity, and same thing. I mean, we want to make sure that what we're storing in the database is what we. And then security is a big one, and I know it's the last one on this, but when you're thinking about Laravel and a lot of things that are baked into Laravel, they kind of help you not make very dangerous. But it used to be, look, if you weren't validating your stuff in procedural PHP and you're running against like your MySQL Connect and all that kind of stuff, the SQL injections, all that kind of stuff. So that's why we need it. There's a couple types of validation, client side and server side. And we're going to talk a little bit about client side, but mainly we're going to focus on server side. But the interesting thing is that HTML5 offers a lot of in the browser validation. And so you can add like a required attribute at the end, which works really well. You can do pattern matching against regular expressions, which is cool. You can do min length, max length, number ranges, steps, etc. So you can input type equals number, input type URL. I mean, they have a lot of these cool input types that you can do in HTML5. I never really got into that in my procedural PHP years because that was really before a lot of the HTML5 stuff. But I did do a lot of JavaScript client-side validation. And whether that was simply using jQuery to check or kind of rudimentarily putting something in, we would always check things on the client side before sending it over to the server side. But the point is, server side is needed no matter what you're doing on the front end. You're just trying to create a great experience, but you're not getting the fact that things need to happen. So, like I said, we're going to talk a little bit about client-side stuff, but mainly this is going to be about server-side validation inside Laravel. I have this kind of long point here. So when I started learning Laravel and watching Laracast, I was shown several ways to do the same thing, and it was frustrating because I just wanted to know the best way. But I learned after a while that the beauty of Laravel is not the best way to do. Is that the best way to do it depends on what you're doing. And knowing several ways to do the same thing will help you make the right decision. So I'm going to show you basically the same thing several different ways, not to confuse you and not to say that one is better than the other, but hopefully expose you to the different ways that they're out there that will fit well with you. So let's dive in. I've got this basic form here, and what I want to first do is kind of talk about some of the built-in validation rules that exist inside Laravel. So, I mean, just raise your hand if you've used validations inside Laravel before and you're familiar, sort of the docs page that lists all these things. So, let me look. That's good. Sometimes not working. Yeah, that's cool.
The pessimist. You weren't optimistic. Sometimes works.
Well, it's interesting. There is a rule that you can throw in there called sometimes, which when I Googled it, I was like, this is the dumbest. Anyway, cool. At least it's not the most embarrassing thing to find in my URL bar, that's for sure. So anyway, there's this validation page, and of course, as you expect with Laravel, you've got a lot of really, really great stuff. And so most of my talk comes right. But as we scroll down, if I can find, they have kind of a list of available validation rules. And so on this particular page over here, I've picked a few of them to kind of show you, how it works, and some of the neat ones and some of the ones that would be more sort of expected or standard. And I'm going to show you how that works inside Laravel. But you can have a variety of built-in things that are within the framework that allow you to validate that data. And so as we look at that, I'm going to show you this. This is a Laravel 5.6 app. I'm going to give you a quick look. Here's my routes file, which is not fancy whatsoever. You've got my slide 1, slide 2, slide 3, slide 4, so on and so forth. And then I have a few controllers. I've got Form 1, Form 2, Form 3, and Form 4 controllers. And this is, basically everything right here. Nothing too fancy at all. And if it was a talk about routes files, it's different. But let me jump into Form 1 controller. So the first thing that we want to see is that at the very top, I have this method, my store method here. I have a request that's coming in. This is very, very typical Laravel. But here I've named my all the named values that are coming in. So let me pull up So here's this form, and this is very standard. I honestly, when I did PHP artisan make auth, and then I copied, that file, and so I mean, it follows. Laravel 5.6 is using Bootstrap 4, which has a little bit changes, a little bit differences. I've noticed a few bugs or gotchas in this, but for the most part, it's pretty similar. But you can see I've got my different form groups. For example, my input type of email here. There's an HTML5 way to do it. I set a class on there if there's an error, and there's this other helper called old, which will grab the old value. So when you see that, and I'll kind of show you how that works. But this is basically it. And then below it, I'm going to show if there's an error related to that particular field, I guess I don't know what the term would be, then it'll show the error down below. But really, the main thing that I want you to see is that we've got all these different rules that are associated here, and these all relate back to that form. Now, if I look here and I try to submit the form as it is on this page, you can see I've got all this stuff, and I hit submit. You can see it. I see this. Please fill out this form field. And the reason I see that is this is the HTML5 validation that's happening. So it's not even submitting it back to Laravel yet. It's doing it in here, and it's realizing that it's there. So while I have required on the front end, on the client side, I've also got required on the. You got to have it. But this is the only one where I've attached that. And so as soon as I add something to it, and then I hit submit, you're going to see, oh boy, we've got a lot of errors that are coming through. And so we're going to talk about these just a little bit and some of the neat ones. Email address is pretty straightforward. I'm sure we all have had different functions or things back in the day where we're sort of checking regular expressions in these email addresses to figure out if it's an actual email address. In this particular case, it's cool because I've got I'm checking against my users table. So if I hit submit, you're going to see that I didn't get an error. The fact that the value is still there is there because I'm using that old helper that I showed where it's grabbing all the old content that was submitted before. It just does it for you automatically. But if I look inside SQL Pro, you can see that I seeded you went in here and I created 25 users. And so if I go in here and I grab Dr. Jacob Walter's email address and I go back and I try to submit that, it's going to tell me that the email has already been taken. And so this is happening because in my email validation rule, you can see that I have email, and then this is separated with that. I think that's like the pipe or whatever. I don't know what the technical term is. So I know I'm checking against it being an email address, and so that it has like the right sort of regular expression that has that pattern, but it's also unique to the users table, which is kind of a handy thing. In addition to that, you can say, you can also pass in like unique, if not this one, or something like that. So there's a lot of different things you can do, but it's a nice little touch to add on those validations. The next one I'm going to show you, if I say google.com, right? Submit, you see that we didn't get an error there. But the neat thing about this is that it's not actually using just pattern matching regular expression. So if I make it a bunch of garbage and submit, that URL is not a valid URL. And so this is using the rule called active URL, which according to the docs uses, what is it? The field under validation must have a valid A or quadra A record according to the get DNS record PHP function. So it's kind of cool. So it's actually going out there and checking for that when you're doing it. So that's a handy thing as well. It's not, like I said, it's not just pattern.
It's just checking domain, though. It's not checking like whatever's after slash. Here.
Yeah.
It's not making a curl request.
Yeah.
Right. Does the email check the domain?
No, it doesn't, but it could. And I don't see why it could. Okay, so we have some more basics here to go through. This count field, for example, must be an integer. Now, you see, when I submitted that, without anything in there, I got this. I got the validation error on it. And the reason why it does is there are a couple things. A couple reasons. You have to, because of Laravel, by default now will do like run trim and all your stuff, and it'll send like a null value over, and so you have to tell it that you're okay with null on that end, and you also can tell it that to only evaluate run the rule if something is there. So for example, if I go into count and I say sometimes, right? This is the sometimes thing I was talking about, and I say nullable. And then I save, I should be able to submit this form now and not have it complain. But the fact that I didn't have sometimes and nullable on there is why it complained, right? So I'll just put this back. The other thing to note about this is this HTML is an input type of number. And so if I try to type like Alex right here, you can hear me typing, right? Nothing is showing up because it'll only allow for the integers, right? Which is great. However, I mean, somebody could be totally sneaky if they wanted. And so let's get sneaky. And so if I inspect this element and I go in here and I just change my value, I say mel and I say value equals ha 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 ha. Now that's in there. I don't see it in there, but if I try to submit, you can see that I do get that it must be an integer. So while I'm doing the things on the front end to make the best experience that I can, we're not counting on it always being there on the back end. And like I said, that rule is simply integer.
This guy's a hacker.
Yeah, totally, right? Another couple ones that are kind of neat, like I have this one, part 1 and part 2. So when I submit this form, I'm not getting an error for any of that. And if I submit hello in part 2, we're good, right? But if I submit hello in part 1 and submit, then I get part 2 field is required when part 1 is present. So this is in the docs as well, very well documented, but it's like required if something this. They also have like required if other things aren't there. I mean, they have a bunch of different permutations of that, but it's kind of a neat thing. The future date stuff, pretty straightforward. 2002, it's going to tell me the same error that it's not a valid future date. It must be a date after tomorrow. So if I say that should be good to go. Handy, same thing. So we have after it, and we also have future or equal. I don't know why I included them both, but just for the fact of the matter is that it's there. It also does really cool stuff with images. And so if I grab, like this one, for example, it has to have a minimum of 1,000 by 1,000. So if I grab this tiny Hulk photo and I throw it on there and I submit, then you're going to see that the photo is invalid image dimension. So it'll do cool things like checking. So I mean, that's probably handy if you're doing something where you need something printed or whatever the case may be. Same thing. If I go back in here to let me grab my big Hulk right there. Look at this one. Isn't that hilarious? I'm going to grab this one, and I'm going to throw it in that one. And then I'm also going to grab this GIF, Nacho Man. And so this particular one down on the bottom it reads the MIME type of the file. And so we're going to give it a GIF, even though it's only going to accept JPEG. And you can see that photo must be of type JPEG, but this one didn't give me an error because it was big enough. Unless somebody else has a better way, I've never been able to find a good way to store the old value of whatever file was eventually uploaded. You could probably kick something back from the temp file. I'm not really sure. Anyway, I've always found that whenever I'm trying to do uploads, if it doesn't work the first time, you're going to have to add it. And then I also have this terms. The terms, I agree to the terms that I haven't read. The interesting thing about this is that, and I was reading about Bootstrap 4 and some of the validation stuff. It's even though I have a thing to print, I don't know what it is. I have to have a certain class on the container and blah blah blah. That's why you see my inputs have this all the way around because I had to put form control on it. I wasn't about to go into the world of Bootstrap 4, but that's why you see this is on there. And anyway, this one is required because I've got it set up as accepted is the rule that it must be. So in any checkbox, if you say accepted, that'll make sure that it's there. Anyway, these are all built in, and they're really kind of cool. Another thing, though, to see is that, if I go in here and I leave my email address off, and I submit, my message is the email must be a valid email address. But Laravel makes it very easy to customize what those messages are. So if I uncomment this stuff, and forgive the weird comma placement just so I can comment it out, you can see that when you pass the next parameter in the validate method, I say email.email. Now that's a little confusing, but the field name is email, and then the email is the rule. We say we need your email address. And then same thing down here, url.active URL. Check the inner tubes on that one, right? And so that way you can specify, if you want to, you can change them. So I'm going to leave email out, and I'll leave that one right there, and I'll submit these. You can see we need your email address and check the inner tubes on that. So you can customize those error messages. Pretty nice. Any questions on some of these built-in validation rules? Anything feeling good? All right, let's cruise. I'm going to go to the next example here. Creating your own rule is kind of a fun thing. I have used it once in production where I've had to create my own rule, and that's actually kind of my thinking behind maybe giving this talk is that I did have to come up with one, and I thought it was pretty clever. Basically, I have a client who's got their users logging into their own dashboard, and they just wanted to be able to follow a link over to mine and be authenticated that way. Wanted to be able to validate that the crazy string and everything that we're sitting over matches and hashes and all this. So I built a custom validation rule, and this was in Laravel 5.4, I think, when I did it, or maybe 5.5. But I had it built in the service container. And I thought that's how you do it. But in the later versions, they've come out with a couple better ways to do this, and so I'm excited. I'm not even going to get into the service container, so I'm going to show you these other ways to do it. But there's an artisan command make rule, and so I made one called polite. So say, for example, I say, say hello, and I try to submit it. Say your input must begin with please. So I made a rule that says whatever it is has to begin with please. And so when I run PHP artisan make rule, you're going to see in my rules directory, I have a polite file, and it's really pretty basic. Let's check it out. So we go down here to the passes method here, and we have exception attribute and the value. I return whether or not, and I'm using this helper function that comes with Laravel starts with. The string to lower of the value is please. So it'll return true or false, and then I can also set my message down here. So your input must begin with please. And you can also use, I believe, pretty easily, the value name or the attribute name in that message as well as before. But that's how it works. So if you want to create a rule, now obviously you could get more complicated than this, but this was, I thought, a good one-line example of a custom rule that you would build. To use this, I'm going to look at Form 2 controller. To use this, I just use app rules polite at the top. And then in my request validate, my field is called favor, and I just say new polite. And it's going to use that polite file to check and see what it is. Now, I have this other example down here. Because of the way that you're doing it using those rules, if you want to pass other rules, you can't pipe them like you can before. So you have to put them in this sort of array notation, syntax, whatever it is. And so I make it required and then new polite. But that's how you could keep stacking on any sort of existing rules on it. So that's kind of cool. So if I say please, and you can see that in my rule, I do a string to lower starts with. So I could say like, please say hello, and ta-da, it's valid. So you can see that it basically, the way that this works inside the controller, and I should have kind of mentioned it in the first one too, that basically at the beginning, if things are valid, we're going to just keep on keeping on. And if they're not valid, it returns you back to that page with the list of errors and with all your old values. And it just sort of happens behind the scenes. Now you're using that when you're using the validate method on the request. You can use the facade, the validate facade that also comes with Laravel. If you do that, you have to be responsible for sending the user back to the page with the old values and with the errors. They've made this better in the last couple of years. So I always typically just lean on using that the validate method on the request, and it works out pretty well. That way you know that if you're down here, like things are good, which is really pretty handy. Let's look at the next example. This is reply and add value to a well thought out comment. And so this is an example of using closures instead of using a rule to do the validation. So it's going to be the very similar. In this case, I'm going to check if somebody, I think what bugs me a lot, and maybe I get annoyed too easily, is when people reply to a well thought out comment and they just type this, right? And so I have reply is invalid, right? And so let's look at how that works. So if I look at form 3 controller, it's going to look very similar. I have my request. Reply is the name of my field. It's required. It has a max length of 255. And then also, we have this function down here in the closure. If the string to lower value is this, then it's going to return fail, saying the attribute name is invalid. So you can do it, and this is recommended if you've got just a one-off time where you're not going to be using that same validation anywhere else, and you just want to throw it in your controller. If that's your jam, throw it in the controller, and you can do it that way. Same thing, like if I comment that out and say I can use value, adds no value whatsoever. So it makes it pretty easy. You can change that to whatever, and that's a handy way to do it if you know you're only doing. Cool, good. All right, I've got one more example for you. We're going to look at using the request class. So you can use the artisan helper make request, and this is a little bit different. But I don't know how often people use this. Raise your hand. Are you guys using this a lot? Yeah. Okay, so the value to this is when you want to have super clean controllers and little things going on. And also, if you're getting really complicated with some of your validation, it's just a nice place to have it. Puts it in its own home without cluttering up your controller. But imagine that I run PHP artisan make request, and then I called it contact post, and then my message has a minimum of 3. But I want to show you how that works. I'm going to look at my form 4 controller, and you can see that there's really nothing going on here, right? I die and dump if it's valid. So where does my stuff happen? If I look at requests, contact post, you can see that this class is in here. There's a couple extra things that are happening. There's this first section that comes at the top called authorized. By default, it's set to false. So it's going to stop requests right away. Now, if you're using gates and policies and different that for that, that would be a good place to throw that in there if you don't want to have it in your controller. But that can validate whether or not this particular user has the ability to edit or create or whatever you want to do, right? Based on this, and that a gate and policy talk would be a whole other thing. But anyway, for this case, I'm saying, yes, true, you're authorized to be here. So I go down to the bottom, the rules, I'm returning message is required and it has to be a minimum of 3. And then, hey-oh, this wasn't part of the original scaffolding generated stuff, but I add the messages method down here, and then I can return the title is required, body is required. Which is silly because I'm not using any of those. Copy and paste, right? Anyway, yeah, we all know what I'm saying. But anyway, if I go through here and I just try to submit hi, assuming I didn't break anything, yeah, the message must be at least 3 characters. And so the cool thing about this is in this controller, all I'm doing is I'm type hinting that request, and I'm saying it's a contact post because I made that request, and I'm including and I use that request up here. And so because I'm typing it and I'm putting it there, we're not even getting here unless it passes all that validation. It's nice if you're into the mindset of you keep that controller little, which I try to as much as I can, right? But the cool thing is, and if I just say hello or whatever, it's valid. So we're here because of that rule, that path. So in conclusion, we talked a little bit about being able to do this directly. If we look at form 1, directly on the request with the validate method right there in your controller, it will, like I said, push you back to that other previous screen with all the old data and all the errors if there's any problem here. Then we looked at using PHP Artisan make rule, which is kind of nice. I really like that approach. And the third one I said with the closure, this is good if you've got kind of a one-off rule that you want to do. And then finally, the fourth one is using the request which is probably something that I should get more into. I think the first time I went through the Laracast tutorial, Jeffrey was using the requests there. And I just thought that's how you had to do it. And then when I realized that you didn't necessarily have to do it, it seemed a little bit simpler for me to not use it. But I think in terms of organization and clean code, it makes sense to use those requests. But anyway, this is really by like 4 ways to do something very similar, very similar things, and expanding on the already, there's a big group of those baked in rules. And so you should check out the validations page on the docs. Read through, there's a lot of them. I mean, even when I was going through it yesterday and today, there's new stuff on there. So there's a lot of cool stuff. But when you do have to come up with your own thing, your own validation, or you want to customize those messages, it's really not the end of the world, and it's kind of fun to do it. The end.